Eso es mío. Yo no sé qué te pasa, sí, sí. Bueno, empecemos. Eh, bueno, muy buenas tardes y bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta primera charla en un ciclo de conversaciones que vamos a tener este semestre sobre psicología y acción climática. Y acción, sí, y sostenibilidad, como se tituló. Entonces, para esta primera charla, organizada por Johan Díaz, del Departamento de Psicología, estamos con la presencia de la profesora Sonia Gay. Quiero recordarles que en el Departamento de Psicología hay algunas actividades que estamos desarrollando, no solo en este tema tan importante, sino en otros que no sé, sabemos que la psicología tiene gran incidencia. Para los que no lo saben, el Departamento de Psicología de 50 años este semestre, y estamos repensándonos un poco acerca de nuestro papel en la academia y en la sociedad más amplia. Y con esto dejo al organizador de las charlas, Johan. Muchas gracias.
Vale, William, muchas gracias. Buenas tardes para todos. Y yo quisiera empezar con una anécdota. Ya van a ser hace 15 años, mientras hacía mi maestría en evaluación y psicometría, con el ansia de buscar un tema distinto a lo estadístico y lo metodológico, encontré un título de una electiva muy prolijo, así, psicología ambiental. Y fue como, ok, eso existe, y esto fue hace casi 15 años. Y entramos, y creo que ese momento y ese curso me dio uno de los mayores insights que he tenido en la vida, de los insights más poderosos que he tenido, y sabemos que estamos en una crisis climática, y esa crisis climática que comprende, bien sabemos, pérdida de biodiversidad, este fenómeno pues, que es tan complejo como el cambio climático y la contaminación en distintos aspectos. Esa crisis ambiental es de origen antropogénico, o sea, es causado por el ser humano. O sea, cuando yo entendí eso, dije, wow, y yo dije, ¿qué se puede hacer ahí? Yo, ¿por qué estoy tomando este curso? Y la premisa que se deriva de esa primera frase es: el comportamiento humano es el que está causando todas estas problemáticas ambientales. Y pues, ¿quiénes son los llamados a diseñar programas de intervención para modificar cualquier conducta? ¿Quiénes son los encargados de analizar y comprender estos fenómenos? ¿Quiénes son los encargados de promover comportamientos proambientales? Los psicólogos, la psicología. Ese insight creo que determinó muy buena parte de mi vida profesional y investigativa. Y ese curso lo dictaba la profe Sonia Gay. Entonces, para mí es un placer. Sonia es doctora en psicología, con un énfasis inicialmente en cognición. Ahora estamos discutiendo trabajos sobre contrafácticos y temas factuales también. Pero su vida la fue llevando también por caminos sobre investigaciones en consumo responsable, principalmente en consumo responsable, resaltando elementos normativos, emocionales y cognitivos en cómo se puede promover esos comportamientos responsables, particularmente en consumo. Así que bueno, creo que es una joya tenerla hoy acá, recordar todos estos años. Y nada, estoy seguro que tiene un montón de cosas para decirnos, según lo que me ha dicho, entonces no quiero quitarle más tiempo. Sonia, un placer.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación primero. Y yo también quería empezar con una anécdota, pero muy chiquito. Lo que quiero hacer hoy quizás para ustedes, y ya voy a cambiar al inglés porque el mundo académico que yo me siento más en casa es inglés y no el español. Porque sí, cuando la gente me pregunta a qué me dedico, todavía hasta hoy me pasa, yo digo, soy psicóloga ambiental, así me identifico y me dicen, ¿qué hace un psicólogo ambiental? ¿Qué será? Están abrazando árboles, ¿qué hacen? Y bueno, si quieren pueden abrazar árboles, pero no es que nos dedicamos principalmente, ¿no? Como, y hay un montón de diferentes temas que podemos abordar desde la psicología para el medio ambiente y la sustentabilidad. Y eso me gustaría como darles hoy como una idea de lo que puede ser. Si alguien les pregunta en la semana que viene qué sería, qué tenía que ver la psicología con la sustentabilidad, que pueden decir, bueno, pues escuché una conferencia y tengo algunas ideas si quieren escuchar, ¿no? Bueno, y eso me gustaría sí, brindarles, pero voy a cambiar al inglés, ¿no? Porque me sale mejor. Pero si pueden, si algo demasiado rápido o quieren profundizar en algo, puedo recibir preguntas en español. Bueno, vamos a empezar, ¿no? Yeah, I'd like to talk to psychology's contribution to societal transformation towards sustainability. And as you can already tell, it doesn't have that much the title climate change, although we will hear a lot about climate change, because the picture I would like to paint is a little bit wider than that we need a whole societal transformation towards sustainability. And that also includes aspects because we have to because of climate change, but not exclusively. And what I would like to start with tell you a little bit what are the current ecological challenges, but only briefly, and what we could do about it. And then we'll dive into what's psychology's role in about what we can do about it. So I think we're all familiar with like different news of different types. This, for example, was titled by The Guardian lately that the hottest day on the planet that was ever recorded in our history of recordings was the which one of July, 24th of July this year, so only 3 weeks ago. And amongst the 10 hottest days, they were all in the last couple of years. So we all hear news like this every day. And I wanted to bring some of you would know better. I don't know too much about the climate change consequences here in Colombia, but obviously there is some kind of drought at the moment in Bogota, and you have to start saving water. And that brings us to all these new, to this news that might be a little bit alarmist, where's the world gonna go? And to give you a couple of headlines, for example, this is a Time headline, be worried, be very worried, this like alarmist vocabulary as well. That's a headline that's more than 20 years old. That was in the beginning of this millennia, it was titled. And I even brought an older, this is one of the big cathedrals in Germany, in Cologne, the Kölner Dom. And that one at the left side is already from the early 90s, I think. And they recycled that kind of 30 years later, as in, apparently we're still in big trouble, but obviously the big cathedral is still standing and it doesn't look like this. So the question might be a little bit, environmentalists like this, you might have all heard about Greta Thunberg. Has she made it to Colombia as well? Okay, the young Swedish lady who has started a big movement in Europe. In our school, my two daughters also went to a couple of those Friday marches for the climate. And she has said in the Davos meeting, I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic and act as if the house was on fire. And another big movement is the Extinction Rebellion, and they already have it in their name, like they're rebelling against something that they see like an imminent threat, like that might be the extinction not only of other species, but also the extinction of the human species. So a little bit the question arises, have we always been alarmist, and the news have always been bad, or is it warranted that we actually act like this? And therefore, I would like to give a short introduction that's not as psychological, but more like a general idea. What do Earth system scientists say about this? And I think one model that is super helpful for all of us to understand what's going on is the one of planetary boundaries. And that has been brought forth by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and it's also now, because the director of the Stockholm Resilience Center now changed to Germany, to the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change Consequences, and that is being continuously updated. And they've come up with this idea of planetary boundaries that are thought to be like ecological guardrails that are thought to safeguard the stability of the Earth system. So the idea, if we stay below a certain threshold, the Earth system has a higher probability to stay stable. And the most important thing about it, there's 9 of them. So climate change is only one of them. Yeah, you see another one is biosphere integrity, is another word for biodiversity. or land system change, or how we use our fresh water, or the phosphorus and nitrogen cycles in agriculture, for example. And by 2023, actually, obviously, that should be updated to this year because it has not been improved. 6 out of 9 of those boundaries are trespassed, like there we are out of the safe limits of 6 out of 9 boundaries. And I would like to dive into like only 3 of them because we won't have time for all of them, the ones that are most important for this talk. And obviously one of the ones that we know all most about it, because it's also been in the media most, is temperature rise. So worldwide, we're looking at almost 1.4 Celsius, and I've brought the data for Bogota here in case you haven't seen it. So you also have like a substantial temperature rise. And the interesting idea of this, like obviously this is a scientific graph, but they also try to convey the actual information in an artistic way, what they have called climate stripes. So you're familiar, I see people nodding. You can find the climate stripes all over the world. There's one for Berlin, there's like really much for every city. And what we all have in common is it starts in blue and it ends in red. So I think even if you don't know anything about graphs or scientific data or not even temperature measurement, it's an intuitive way of reading what's going on with the temperature. It's going up. And for Colombia, amongst the couple of consequences I researched, it's droughts, water shortages for elevated areas, which would be here, and flooding and cyclones for the coastal areas. And that come with a lot of consequences that will be the content of the second part of the talk. Then another one that might be interesting for you here, I don't know exactly how much troubles you have with deforestation in Colombia, but obviously it's a big one in Brazil as well, so a country near here. And what we've had over the last decades and centuries is a conversion of natural landscapes, like of real nature that people haven't interfered with, into agricultural and urban areas. And since the 1960s, so like the last 60 years, we've lost 20% of our forest cover to deforestation. So, but in the longer picture, it's even more extreme. Like in the 1700s, almost like all of the planet was either wildlands or semi-natural. As you can see, like it's basically all green. And villages and agriculture, then settlements almost didn't exist or not as much. And now we've lost like more than half of the planet to villages and agriculture, then settlements. So 55% of the Earth ice-free land is now used for human agriculture and settlement. So we've left less than half for nature. And this comes with consequences as well, like habitat loss, soil degradation, exacerbating climate change again, because the surface of the planet is reabsorbing differently the heat. And it also comes with biodiversity loss. And that's the third bigger topic I would like to talk about, because also I've heard you have like a big conference on biodiversity here in Cali. Was it Cali of the UN? And obviously Colombia is one of the greatest hotspots of biodiversity. And I obviously would be lovely if it stayed this way. But I guess biodiversity is one of the biggest planetary boundary threshold exceeding of all of them. So that has different aspects. Like we usually think about species, that species go extinct, but also obviously individual organisms are lost. Gene pool diversity is lost and ecological habitat. But the most well-known consequence is that we have species going extinct at a higher rate than, like, not almost always before, because this is what has been coined the 6 mass extinction. So there have been 5 mass extinction events in all of the geological era of the planet Earth. So think one is dinosaurs going extinct. And now we're like in the 6 mass extinct events. So species are currently going extinct at a rate 1,000 times higher than the background rate. So what you can see down here in gray is the background rate. Species always have gone extinct and news have come up. And that's where I probably have to leave it, because I'm not an ecologist, but a psychologist. I just wanted to point out it's not only climate change, and all these different planetary boundaries are interlinked. And yeah, they have impacts on one another. So yeah, the biodiversity loss might be a big issue here in Colombia. So from here, where are we going? What are we doing? And one model, obviously we're scientists, we work with models, and they're not an exact picture of what's going on, but it's always very helpful to have a model to like where we're going to. And one model I found very helpful to kind of put my own research into is the donut model of sustainable development, and that's been brought forth by Kate Raworth in the UK. And she has used the exact 9 planetary boundaries we've just heard. It might be a little bit of a different wording, but here she says biodiversity loss, land use change, climate change, freshwater use. It's those 9 planetary boundaries. And the simple idea basically is if humanity wants to thrive on this planet, we have to stay below those environmental or inside these planetary boundaries, below an environmental ceiling. But also, obviously, people need food, water, health, they need shelter, education. There's some human needs we have that we need to have tended to if we want to have a healthy and a thriving life. So we also have to be above the social foundation, which is the inner purple circle here. So now you can guess why it's called a donut model, because it has the shape of a donut, what she calls a safe and just space for humanity to thrive. And this is where we want to go into. We want to get into the donut. So as for a short metaphor, like what's supposed to happen. And this can also be linked to the SDGs. I'm not quite sure how familiar you are with the developmental goals of the United Nations. And it's not exactly possible to map all 17 of them, but most of them have either something to do with the ecological ceiling, like, for example, climate action. I put it in Spanish, vida submarina en vida ecosistemas terrestres, or the more social ones, like the first 10 SDGs are more for the social ones, like ending poverty, making sure everyone has to eat, and all that. So we could also relate what we're doing now to get into the donut with the SDGs. So far, this is like a little bit the idea, what is even happening and where do we want to go? And the next thing I would like to present is there's different ideas how we're going to get there. And one general idea of different strategies for sustainable development, that's by a German author. So this is the idea that's been used in Germany a lot. I'm not quite sure how internationally disseminated it already is that we have 3 basic strategies to get to a more sustainable life. One is efficiency. We're super invested in that in Germany. You know, we have more efficient cars, more efficient this, more efficient that. That's the idea, achieving the same result with less resources or emission. And that's actually obviously a good idea to start with. So it's like an improved production here. It's like the idea of a 3-liter car, like and not the motor engine size, but how many liters of gas, do you say here, gasolina, it needs for 100 kilometers. That would be a super low efficient car. And just to spoil that a little bit, I have not seen one or not many in the streets of Germany either. And I'll tell you in a second why. After the second strategy, that's called consistency. And that's instead of changing something quantitatively, qualitatively, like trying to change production into a nature-based way that's agreeable with nature, for example, nature-based materials. So that would be an idea. And I know that's also contestable, that we, for example, use renewable energies and start electrical cars that are fed by renewable energy. And as I already insinuated, both of them come with their perhaps one more thing to say. Those are more pointed at research and development, you know, that companies should do that. They should invent better products or better processes. But both come with their problems. The first one is rebound effects, that in case of using these efficiency gainings for like smaller cars that have a more less gas usage, what's happened, and also in Germany, people have bought bigger cars, and we are at the same gasoline usage than 20 years ago. We've just bigger cars for doing the same thing. And obviously, if we do consistency things, that's a picture of the of a lithium farm in Bolivia that comes with ecological lithium is needed for the car batteries for electric cars. So some of these consistency-based ideas swap one technology for another one that comes with different problems. So that's also like, it could be a part of the solution, but it comes with its own problems. So there's this third strategy that has been smiled upon for a long time, you know, that we might also have a sufficiency strategy that's more about, of the actual word, meaning that something is sufficient, that something is enough, that we can live enough or well enough of something that's, that we have. would be reducing a consumption level to a good measure, like a measure that allows us to live a good life with the least input possible. And that would mean perhaps just changing to some different behavior altogether. For example, changing from a car to a bicycle, or generally buy less or not even having a car. And that is a third strategy that, for example, in more technological advanced societies, as Germany, has been smiled upon a little bit. Or the hippies, they want to go a little bit more with a sufficient measure, but it has gained more momentum in the realization that those two strategies might not be enough to start all the changes that we need. And that is obviously, this third strategy is the most targeted at what Johan said in his introduction, where psychologists could actually do something because it has something to do with behavior change. And before diving deeper into what are the different fields of where psychology could contribute, I would like to show one slide, which is a little bit complicated, but I think it's good to introduce it for the discussion I would like to have with you later, that this all is embedded in a bigger picture that comes from sociology, not as much from psychology, and that's called a multi-level model of societal transformation. And I try to run you through it. If you don't understand all the details, it doesn't really matter. Like, I will make my main point, as the idea is, how do we get from trespass planetary boundaries into the donut? And if societies want to change, that this change starts or is happening simultaneously in different levels, like on what they call a micro level, with niche innovations where individuals do different things. They start cycling, for example, instead of going by car. But then we have this regime level, the socio-technical regime, like the meso level, where we have all these institutions like our policies, our industry, science, technology, culture, all that is already heading with its own momentum. So this is like what you can think about the Titanic moving towards the iceberg, really hard to move because it has already a momentum to stay where it is, and it wouldn't go without any interference into the donut. And then the biggest level, or the highest level, is what they call a socio-technical landscape of these like big macro developments, like a pandemic hits and all of a sudden we can't fly anymore, we can't go eat out anymore, we start cooking ourselves, we change our consumption behavior because we have to, because we can't leave the house. I don't know how hard the restrictions were in Colombia. I lived in Berlin in the first wave of Corona, and we couldn't leave our houses besides grocery shopping for like weeks. So a lot of things changes. Another bigger development obviously could be wars break out, Russia, Ukraine, all of a sudden certain foods become more expensive or less available because of the war. So this is changing or generating pressures on the system to make changes it wouldn't otherwise have. And what I would like to, at the very end of the talk, after we heard all psychology could do, perhaps discuss a little bit together, where do we see psychology? Because our first nudge is obviously must be individual. You know, we can change behavior of person A and person B, and we can do that, but we can do more than that. Like, we can also interfere, understand this, at least the meso level, if not perhaps sometimes also something about the macro level. So that's what I would like to send before. And yeah, okay, we're still not, or hopefully not too far into the time. So now I would really like to get more into what psychology has to say about all this, like psychological approaches to the ecological crisis. And now you will hear a little bit about climate change, because I think the first ecological crisis psychologists woke up to also was climate change, because we were also only people and we read the news, and then people said, oh, perhaps we have something to do with climate change. But some of it also applies to the other planetary boundaries I've introduced first. And in general, I would like to introduce environmental psychology as one discipline or subdiscipline branch of psychology that is concerned with the relationship between human beings and the environment in which they live. Very broad definition. And as we'll later see, they're not the only psychologists that have something to contribute to resolve these crises. And in general, most of those topics have a lot to do with human health. So there's also an overlap with health psychology. For example, the restoration effects, that means the positive effects nature has on us. Everybody knows when we're stressed and we go for a walk through the woods, this actually empirically proven that it makes us feel better. So it has a lot to do with our psychological well-being, or also negatively how environmental stressors could impact our health negatively. And for one example, I know the example comes later. And on the other hand, how we humans behave also impacts our environment. And the most obvious is, for example, our individual behavior, our individual greenhouse gas emissions, but also how we support political advocacy or activism for environmental causes. So it's a two-way road, like a two-way street. The environment impacts us, but we also impact the environment. And for example, one of the things I'll be talking about for this effect, it could also be something how climate change impacts our well-being in terms of eco-anxiety. And for this effect, like how humans impact the environment, the most obvious of all would be behavior change. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So the first bigger institution that has actually issued a report on that, although that's already the second edition, was the American Psychology Association of the United States. And they recommended, what can we do in psychology in climate crisis? And they put it into like 3 different fields. There would be first mitigation, then adaptation, and then general as a cross-cutting field. It could be both public opinion. So mitigation has to do with reducing energy material consumption emissions. So sufficiency would fall under that as well. So it could be anything, motivations to adopt new technologies, behavior change, but also on an organizational level, changes in the environment. Whereas adaptation is more like, we have a lot of consequences of climate change already locked in. A couple of things will already come. Temperature will rise a little bit. Even if we stopped with CO2 emissions tomorrow, we will have sea levels rise. We will have probably climate-related migration and all that. And understanding and adjusting to those changes that are going to come is called adaptation. And that would touch us in psychology, for example, with mental health conditions, the social problems associated with climate change, for example, anxiety, trauma, or grief, or the effects of climate change on our health-related behaviors, that our diet might change, our sleep patterns, etc. And the third one is more about understanding public opinion about that. That's obviously something we're really good at in psychology, measure and empirically gather data, empiric data on what people think, for example, on the risk perception, or also their preferences of what we should do with the situation in mitigation and adaptation. And now my talk will follow this rough structure. I will talk first about what can we do in mitigation, then in B, what could be one possible topic, and what could be one possible topic in C, in public opinion. Now we'll give examples from sometimes of classic studies other people have done before me, and sometimes my own current studies I do in each of these fields. So the first one would be 2A, understanding and changing mitigation behavior. And mitigation behavior is just another fancy name for like pro-environmental or sustainable behavior. And that was a little bit the core thing that we did in environmental psychology, pro-environmental behavior. But that you're not mistaken as it would be only, for example, I don't know, switching off the light when you leave the room. Or perhaps we can gather some examples from the audience. What do you do as a pro-environmental behavior? If you feel like I want to do something for the environment, what do you do differently as would you normally do? Was that a hand raise? No.
Taking public transport.
Taking public transport is a big one. You leave your car at home and you go by bus. Wonderful. About composting at home. Yeah, you compost your food waste. Yeah. Showering. Yeah, showering a bit quicker, not using that much water. That's 3 perfect examples of pro-environmental behavior you could do in the private sphere, like what you do at home. But that's just the beginning. You could also start talking in your social network. You can start organizational behaviors. For example, I'm not quite sure what you do with the recycling here on campus, or starting to impact public opinion. For example, I don't know, running for public office just is already a lot, but for example, organizing a petition or something, or a march here at campus. And that is mirrored in an older paper by Stern, who's a very well-known environmental psychologist that has already talked about different levels of pro-environmental behavior. And obviously this private sphere consumptions are the ones we're talking a lot in environmental psychology, but let's keep in mind that there's more than that. And I'll give you a couple of examples now on research, what we've done on how to understand and change this private consumption behavior. So it has been defined as the behavior that consciously seeks to minimize the negative impact of one's action on the natural built world. All the three examples you mentioned is a really good example of that. And what we've historically tended a lot of attention to was that we looked at things that people do with a strong intention. I want to save the environment. I'm going to go by bicycle. I want to save the environment. I switch off the light. I compost. I go, yeah, we had it already with bike. What was the third one? Like I shower less. But we haven't really looked as much at behaviors that are still done without the environment in mind. For example, flying. I mean, I didn't walk here either. That's no secret. And what those behaviors have, I don't do them because I do want to harm or not harm the environment. I want to do them because I have a thing to do here, coming to an exchange, doing this lecture, or I use my mobile phone for my information. But these things have a bigger or less bigger impact on the environment. So this is a dimension we haven't really looked at in environmental psychology for a long time, that we should be starting looking at these strong impact behaviors, no matter if they're intentional or not. Like if people fly, that really harms the environment, no matter whether they do it intentionally or not, saving the environment. And that is something that has been missing in those definitions and that we have tried to put into our definition of sustainable consumption behaviors. Otherwise, I would say it's a very similar definition, the consumption behavior, but we also want to look at impact. And that has its own SDG, like together with production, but sustainable production and consumption is one of the 17 SDGs. And we defined those behaviors as individual acts of satisfying needs in different areas of life. That would be different consumption areas. For example, you have to eat, you shower in your house, you cycle or you go by bike or public transport. And it goes to all the consumption phases. Like it's not only about buying a nice green product, it's also about how you use them. For example, the showering example, or how you dispose the composting example. So through different consumption phases. And now that's where the donut comes in. It's not only about the environment, it's also about the socioeconomic conditions of other people. So that does not comprise the ecological and socioeconomic conditions of all people to satisfy their needs. So in a way, it's a little bit similar to pro-environmental behavior, but it's more than that. It's basically every time you get up in the morning and you start consuming, showing a consumption behavior that has a more or less bigger impact on the environment, on you. And like obviously the higher the impact, you could symbolize that with like a bigger sphere. So now we're knowing like what kind of behaviors I feel like we should be talking about when we talk about environmental, pro-environmental behavior. Now I would like to talk a little bit about what psychology has done to understand them and later also obviously to make interventions to change them. And not quite sure if the audience, you're all somehow connected to psychology, either students or professionals of psychology. Okay, just to check. If you don't know any of those, like I'm always happy to receive questions. Obviously, environmental psychologists also have started with like these really well-known theories on how to explain behavior. For example, theory of planned behavior by Eisen, that is basically a function, says behavior is a function of behavioral control, social norm, and attitude. And this is a bit extended of how do we form attitudes, usually that we have an awareness of something or that we have information about the actual behavior. And in the environmental sphere, it could be like that we're aware of a problem or have actually very critical knowledge of a problem that forms our attitude. And to give you one example for this, there's a lot of attitude polling about climate change or environmental issues. That's, for example, and polling about climate change will be personally harmful for me. And you can see here in Colombia, you have said apparently more than half of the people feel like it would be personally harmful for themselves, which is way higher than, for example, the United States. People apparently still thought in that year at least, or even in Germany, were like very unperturbed about climate change. And if you contrast that with like, that's the actual climate risk index, but that's pooled over like 2 decades, you're actually right to be concerned, because you're in the bracket of the third bracket between the first 20 to 50 countries to be affected with. But if you look at Germany, we're even ahead. Like, we had this really big floods and a couple of droughts as well. So this is already, it's a weak indicator of that attitudes about something might not be the best base on deciding what to do about it. And that's what we call these early information deficit models. But if you knew about environmental stuff, you would develop an according attitude, and you would show poor environmental behavior. And that's, these early models have been falsified already a lot of times. And we know that from other areas of psychology, that there's an attitude behavior gap, and attitude does not always translate into environmental behavior. And that's partly due, obviously there's other reasons, but it's partly due also because there's so many other influences on our behavior. And one big one are social norms. That's another one really well researched in psychology. And social norms are rules and standards that are understood by members of a group that guide and constrain social behavior without the force of law. That's important. Like, it's not that you would be it's not that you would be punished if you show that, you would be punished in a social way. And they come in different ways. Like, English has a really good saying, not quite sure whether it exists in Spanish as well, do as I say, not as I do. And that already alludes to, there's different types of social norms. And one is, that is, do what I say, an injunctive norm. I would like you to do this or that. For example, in these campaigns about doing things. Like, for example, you have a campaign here on campus, not smoking anymore. I've seen a couple of posters and stuff saying, oh, this is a smoke-free zone, or something like that. That would be an injunctive norm. A descriptive norm is what people actually do. That is, for example, how many people do you see smoking, no matter how many signs, or how many people do you see cycling to the university? And I'm not quite sure, could you corroborate that picture? Are people cycling to the University of the Andes? And I just tried to walk up here this morning, and I just got here yesterday and I was out of breath on my 3rd step. But it would be obviously awesome if people showed that descriptive norm. I haven't seen too many bikes on campus, like, or bike racks with a lot of bikes. That would be another indicator for descriptive norm, just counting the bikes that are parked in front of the house. And I should have brought the picture of Groningen. There's this famous University of Environmental Psychology, Groningen, and there's 1,000 bikes parked in front of the door all the time. So that's a big contrast for a strong descriptive norm. And obviously that's the home area of social psychologists. There's a lot of studies. Now we get to our first empirical studies. One of the classic studies is by Nolan et al. On energy consumption. And they gave people door hangers with different information on social norms, self-interest, social responsibility. And I brought you the information of the first 2, social norm and self-interest. So social norm would be, do what your neighbors do. 77% of your San Marcos resident neighbors do this instead to save energy consumption. And the next one would be self-interest. How much money could you save if you, for example, didn't use the aircon or just put the fan on, or did a couple of energy saving tips? And if you look at that, there's like general information just as a control or environmental protection. You could do that for the environment, or you could do that because you're socially responsible, a social responsible citizen. What do you think, which of the conditions led to most savings? Yeah? That's what we would think at Rational People, saving money, because you want to do that for self-interest. Did somebody else want to say that too, or something else? Yeah. And you know what those psychologists found? It's social norms. It's like the only condition that in the short run showed significantly smaller than the information control, but also in the long run a lower energy consumption. And the interesting thing is, perhaps not even that, but even more interesting, they also asked, how much did the information on your door hangers motivate you to conserve energy? And apparently the people said exactly what, you know, some people in the audience said now, yeah, obviously, no, it's for the environmental protection or it's for my saving money, but nobody said, I'm going to do this because of knowing that my neighbors are doing it. So we are much more social creature than we're actually ready to admit. And that's something that is mirrored in a more recent study of German. That's why the whole study was called Underdetected. Social norms are very strong, but underdetected. And that's what German colleagues of mine like disciplinary colleagues of mine from the University of Leipzig, looked at electrical mobility, which is a big topic in Germany at the moment. It's not as far as in other places, but obviously it's coming now too. And they ask people, why do you not have an electric vehicle? What keeps you from not doing it? What do you think would, we can ask you, perhaps it's a bit different in Colombia. I don't know whether there's a market. Why would you not have an electric vehicle if you do have a car? What would be the reason not changing to electric? Can you even buy electrical car here already?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not easy to charge it everywhere.
Charging, yeah. It's difficult. Where would I charge it? Yeah.
Money.
Money obviously is much more expensive, and that might be, I don't know, you wouldn't do that many long distance trips here perhaps. Germany, that's a big thing, because usually you can charge and then they hold for like 300 kilometers, but you cannot, for example, cross all of Germany. So most people said, well, it's the cost and it's the range. Like I can't even get further than 300 kilometers. Why would I buy an electrical car? And now they have done a huge survey, asked a lot of different things, gender, age, experience, blah, 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 cost-related disadvantage, how much do you think this is expensive? But then they asked for injunctive norm, descriptive norm, provincial norm. Is like in your province, how, oh no, the provincial norm, I think they counted in like how many cars are actually have the, are electrical in, you know, in the database. Subjective norm is what you think what others are doing. And the interesting thing is, I mean, obviously, cost-related disadvantages is significant. It's not that it doesn't matter, but those two, the provincial and subjective norm, is an even bigger, has even a bigger effect in that regression than the actual cost-related advantages. And that's why they called it still undetected. Like we still don't know how strong social norms affect our willingness to buy something or a behavioral decision. It was just intentions. They didn't check in that study. It wasn't whether you are an actual owner, but there was there's at least 2 or 3 regressions with like 3 different dependent variables. That's the one. And would you the buying scenario is like would you willing to buy? And then there's a couple of other regressions, but similar. That social norm is much stronger than other factors. And they asked an additional thing, which has become their big research topic, collective efficacy. And that is the idea that we can do something together. Not only I can do something for climate change, but as inhabitants of these regions, we can do much to noticeably reduce CO2 emissions together. And if you think that you, together with others, are capable of bringing about change, that's also a motivator. But that's not as much the topic for right now. I'm looking at the clock, so I will keep going. Sustainable or environmental behaviors are in a way specific from other behaviors that are perhaps more self-directed. For example, your health behaviors or your social engagement, where theory of planned behavior has been applied a lot successfully, and as they are also a moral issue. And we can illustrate that with, for example, carbon footprint budget calculations. There's a big report on 1.5 lifestyles, and what this is saying is, if we want to stay below 1.5 degree global warming compared to the 1880 baseline, which is the Paris Agreement, which we already almost hit. We hit it for the first time this year, but not in a long-term mean. How much can people emit? Like, and there's different scenarios whether you allow like being like different technologies submitted. So it's a bit hard to like give one number, but it's somewhere between here now in the middle of the 20 years of 2000. The second decade of the 2000s, somewhere between 3 and a bit and lower than 5 tons per capita. Each of us inhabitants of this planet, that's what we could emit if we want to stay below that global warming scenario. And that's a report by the Hot and Cool Institute in Berlin. And what you can see, if you like put that down to scale. So let's assume the upper limit, which is like a little bit looser for us. If that would be like, okay, that's the aim, not a little bit less than 5 tons. If you compare that with the world data where we're at the moment, the world has hit that threshold. We're above that. in Colombia, like that's actually a good data for all of you. If anybody wants to tell you what to do about climate change, you could give them that graph and say, you know, like we're still half of what we could do. So anyone else first? And I also showed that slide in Australia where I lived before and did some of that research that I'm going to show. And that's another story here. You know, Australia is still on 15 tons, more than 3 times as much on par with United States, and even Germany with all its wonderful green ideas. And we have a green government at the moment. The Greens are in a part of the government. We're still on almost double as much where we should be and way above the European Union. So sometimes what I want to say with this graph, 2 things. There's a lot of talk and not that much action. And it's a moral issue also. So it has to do with like, this is a justice issue in our ideas of, should this be evenly distributed amongst all the inhabitants of the planet? And if we agree to that, then we should be also looking at values that could influence whether we even see something as a problem or not, whether we ascribe responsibility. Is that any of my responsibility, how much people emit somewhere else? And then get into a personal norm, like a personal conviction that I should be doing something about this. And that's basically the content of the value belief norm theory. And it's based on this very old idea by Schwartz in the 90s, but he has done research on values already in the 70s on this is general, very broad beliefs about desirable states that transcend specific situation and serve as a general guiding principles in people's lives. And this has been used in environmental psychology a lot. Does this really influence how we conduct environmental behavior? And I will bring you one study we have conducted in with colleagues, and there's these different values. Very general, as I said, and altruistic would be like a world in peace, justice for all, or biospheric value, respect for the earth. Hedonist would be more like, oh, I want to have a good life, enjoy life. And egoistic values are more like about my own values. And a lot of work has done by on that by Linda Steeg and Judith de Groot and Groningen. And we have run a study on clothing behavior, clothing consumption behavior. And the first study was more on like, would you look at more like this ecological, organic materials? And in the second study, it was more about, would you be willing to pay more for fair trade priced products? And what we found in these 4 different value groups is that the first 3 had an influence. Biospheric, more on the ecological, organic material, obviously. The altruistic values, a bigger effect on the second study in the fair trade. But hedonist values also, and this has been forgotten a long time, is that there's also negative predictors of this behavior. So people that are more likely to want to be enjoying life and just buy new clothes are less likely to look for sustainable characteristics of that clothing. And additionally, we also looked at compassion, and we did that as a trait-like scale measure in the first study and an experimental manipulation in the second study, and we got small effects in both of the studies. And yep, as a wrap up, like values are important in environmental behavior, and compassion as a more effective emotional state of being plays an additional role. So this brings me to like wrapping up a little bit already the first part. So what I wanted to say is there's a lot of evidence that in environmental sphere, behavior is a function of both of these areas of what theory of planned behavior posed with social norms and attitudes, but also what value belief norm theory posed with values and ascription of responsibility, with the extension that we also should be looking at more effective. That's something like environmental psychologists woke up to a little bit. We also should look at different emotions like compassion. I only chose 2 on connectedness to nature in studies we looked at. And why is this important? Like these meta theories are important also as a base for using them as leverage points for behavioral intervention, that we not just do a behavioral intervention and hope somebody will change something, but that we can actually appoint to, do we want to change the behavior right away, or the behavioral control, or the social norms? And there's different techniques and approaches to change any of these predictors of behavior. And I just brought a couple of examples. nudging strategies, making norms more salient, giving information about problems, tailored information. But for example, with information, you will not change compassion, or very little likely. But you can do other things to change compassion, for example, mindfulness meditation or photo interventions, or using virtual reality. And the next couple of minutes, I would like to present a couple of intervention ideas. So just as a rough overview of different intervention strategies. So nudging strategies, that is a very broad umbrella term on different approaches like default settings, simplification, or prompts that has been hijacked a little bit by economists, but we will let them go run with it because obviously they are super effective as long as they are present, because they are also that they're influencing directly over the behavior. And one idea would be, for example, that's a smart card of Perth. That would give students a lump sum for going into public transport. Then public transport would become your default setting because that's already paid for. And that's one idea, like making a default something that's, for example, already paid for. The next one, information. And that's what a lot of environmental NGOs do. They still do information campaigns. They campaigning about problems, about causes, sometimes about solutions. For example, here you see Greenpeace Australia. This is climate change also, and you see a bleached reef. And now you might be able to appreciate a little bit why that won't change behavior. That won't change, might change problem awareness, but not automatically behavior, because what all these campaigns do is they inform you on the problem, but not what can be done about it. Norm salience is obviously, as we learned, a more promising approach, and you would simply need to highlight what others deem appropriate or what others do, and ideally it would overlap. It would be the same thing, what others deem appropriate and others do. For example, this is my electricity bill in Germany. It actually really looks like this, where it says, oh, what if you use that for one person, that's really good, like this would be good, and this would be very much, and this is for 2 people or for 3 people, and you get the comparison of what other people had in comparison to your consumption. And the last one I want to go a bit further into, we've experimented a little bit with virtual reality. And one thing is what you can do with virtual reality is you can embody something that's, or someone that's not you, and you can learn to take somebody's perspective. And that could influence over being more connected to that person or entity and showing more compassion. And that's one of the experiments I would like to show a little bit more detail. But first, one more thought on these different intervention strategies. They differ in their effectiveness, but also in their deepness of where they have their leverage points. So where these are super effective as long as they're there, they're rather shallow. As soon as you take the nudges away or the prompts or the simplification, the behavior changes back to the whatever it was before. And these are more deeper intervention points where we actually change the emotional fabric of a person or the connectedness to nature that would be longer lasting, perhaps not right instantly, but in our hope, longer lasting. So what we did with the virtual reality, we're actually trying to, or we did investigate the connectedness that people show to nature. And that's a more effective experimental connection that people have to nature. And our research question was whether we could foster that by embodying nature in a virtual reality setting. And what's the new thing about it is there's a lot of virtual reality research already in embodying other people and taking their perspective. And we did that with a tree. So the people in this super beautiful application that's been developed at the MIT are becoming a tree. And we tested multisensory enhancement versus a regular VR. That's actually not that important, but that's the only picture I have. So the person does have the virtual reality equipment on whilst wearing a weight belt and having a sense diffuser. So it's also the perfume of the tree also was emitted in the actual rainforest. I mean, you might laugh because you have the rainforest right in front of your door, but for people in Germany or in Australia, they would have that in Queensland, but in the southwest where I was, the rainforest is a very removed natural habitat. And so for 5 minutes, you actually start growing as a tree. I've done the application as well, and it's actually really beautiful. You start growing as a tree, you look down and you see the trunk, and at the very end, there comes a bushfire, but that's something else for further debate. But what we wanted to show is whether people who embodied a tree, whether that would be a way to feel more connected to nature. And the simple answer is yes. And it is a really big effect. It's one of the biggest effects I've seen in my career. Like a lot of times, if we do some research, and I think the more experienced researchers would agree, and we look in our data and like, okay, zero effect, hypothesis not supported. Oh my God, did we code something wrong? Let's look at the data again. And it's not like all the time we get data. Oh my God, this worked. Oh my God, this is wonderful. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, I will check whether we coded that correctly again and again and again, because it's a really big effect from, and the one thing is it's pre-VR experience and post-VR experience, it's 6 minutes away. You know, it's like we asked them in like a state measure of how connected do you feel right now at the current moment? And then we asked 6 minutes later and people were like, I've seen people crying coming out of this virtual reality experience because it's so beautiful. So yeah, we're a bit enthusiastic about it because, you know, not only about this main effect on nature connectedness, obviously one day we would like to actually change environmental behavior, but we're still a little bit away. And we also looked in a path model on the underlying mechanisms, whether it's to do with a sense of presence, of being there, the embodiment of the tree itself, or more like a cognitive pathway where people take the perspective of the tree deliberately, and that is actually the stronger path through the bodily sensation of having been this tree. But there's also obviously an effect on the perspective taking that had to do pro-environmental behavior was only approached by donation of their money to a pro-environmental cause. So we're following this up. What kind of emotions are actually underlying this effect, and it looks like it actually is compassion. So that I can give that away already. So this has been already published. The other one is still under review, but it looks good. Second round. So I think we'll be able to get that out soon as well. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. To the development of those virtual reality applications is a super laborious thing. So at the moment, we're working with applications other people have developed. So we couldn't, and you could cut it earlier. That's what you could do. But it's a 6 minutes application. That's all we have. And we're actually starting right now because we want to manipulate things. That's the beauty of as a research approach. You can manipulate. You could potentially manipulate things in this application, but it's very laborious. And my colleague in Berlin, Ms. Spangenberger, who's first author in this paper, she started with a student group to actually design an application how we want it, but it's super laborious. And I think it'll take a while, like until that is ready, until we've done the study, another half year before we even have gathered data. So at the moment, we're restricted to that's the application there is. So this is actually wonderful cooperation projects with digital designers. Like that's what we would need to ask for in a research grant. That a design studio is doing that, and we could just tell them what we need. So wrap up. Okay, we can see already a bit advanced, but the chapter 2 and 3 are a little bit shorter than obviously this is our big one, the mitigation behaviors. As a wrap up, environmentally relevant behaviors occur as soon as you get up in the morning. You consume something, you have some impact on your environment. And it's a function of very different influencing variables. And interventions should start with them and be targeted and tailored to these variables. So amongst different influences are problem awareness, and that needs to be updated because as problems advance, people also need more information. That's a never-ending process. Our social norms are very effective, but underestimated. Values, there's an entry gate for everyone, also people that are hedonistically motivated. You will have to find a way to kind of sell pro-environmental behaviors that are also fun. For example, clothing consumption could be swapping and trading secondhand markets. You know, there is ideas that it doesn't always have to go through the biospheric values, being a typical green hippie. Emotional effectiveness, for example, that compassion and connectedness with nature has great potential of being fostered by virtual reality. So, and in general, we always have that it's easier to influence individuals' motivation. For example, that connectedness to nature, we had a huge effect, and we didn't have that much of an effect on that specific type of behavioral task we had in the laboratory. So we will have to have a look at that. So do you still have some motivation for part B and part C? It'll be a bit shorter so that your head doesn't explode. So the next biggest chapter, the APA report said already or suggested for psychologists, is understanding and supporting adaptation behavior. You know, there'll be things coming towards us we will have to adapt to, and that'll need psychological support. And to make it short, like a lot of it will go through health impacts, and they can be divided in direct and indirect health. So the direct ones, you can be injured because of a severe storm, heat stress in a heat wave, new infectious diseases. I don't know what you have here. Yellow fever might always have been here, but for example, in Argentina, we have a big dengue episode at the moment in places where they never had dengue before. It came down all the way to Cordoba, which is just because of the changes of climate. I think it's those type of mosquitoes that usually would have been found further north, and they're coming down now. So there's new infectious diseases in different places in this world, reduced air quality, and also in psychological impacts, for example, trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. If you lived through like one of these traumatic, direct, severe storms or droughts, or in Australia, there was this huge bushfires, 2019-20, you might have heard that in the news, where like half of the eastern states burned down. And then there's more indirect ones that, for example, you could be affected by water scarcity, like here in Bogota. The food supply could be disrupted, would be harder to feed people. Displacement of people could lead to climate-related migration. And that would be psychological impacts, like living and treating this uncertainty of a future threat that's not there yet already. So what I'll show in a second, people have eco-anxiety about something that hasn't happened yet, but it's more like a potential. And I would like to, oopsie, no, that was too much, sorry. We have to go back, yeah. So what I would like to talk a little bit about those psychological impact, and I feel like we're a little bit in like a Wild West type of situation. A new topic arises because climate change arises, ecological crisis. And you look at the papers, there's a ton of new publications. Everyone uses different vocabulary. We try to order that a little bit for a class at Murdoch University. So the first distinction you can make, is it current or is it about the future? So is a thing you're worried about already happening? And then it could be more ecological grief, like what you're grieving about in relation to an experienced ecological loss that is already happening. So that could be something like acute, you've lived through a bushfire, or more chronic. And that's, for example, mountaineers in the Alpine regions have been the first one to report having something like ecological grief for glaciers lost. I'll give you a more personal example. That's the Black Forest. That's where I grew up, and that were the winters of my childhood, like where we went on slides, and I learned how to ski a little bit, not too good. And those winters, they come once in a while. Like we had a white winter around Christmas 2 years ago, luckily enough, before I left for Australia. But that's not the norm anymore. Like it's very rare that happens. And that's part of a solastalgia, like when a well-known environment has changed or no longer offers the same solace that it used to, that people grieve that. So it's like a certain type of ecological grief. I don't know whether you have an example here, something you lost in Colombia that was here that isn't anymore as it was. Some of you are laughing, like, it might, I don't know whether, do you have glaciers at the very top of the Andes? Yeah, you will definitely have glacial loss as well, like perhaps the mountaineers that go more often to see it and really feel it. That could be a thing. And then we also deal with a lot of emotions that are more to do about the future, like a generalized sense of the ecological foundations are in the process of collapsing, but they obviously haven't collapsed completely yet. And a specific type of that is climate anxiety. We see a lot when it's directly focused on climate change. And that is where a lot of psychological research has been proliferated in the last couple of years. And we still talk about adaptive response when people have worry, fear, anger, or distress about climate change, because obviously something is happening. But if it gets more extreme, or more chronic into helplessness, hopelessness, or even impairs your everyday life, like you can't sleep anymore, you can't concentrate anymore on your work life, it gets towards a maladaptive response. could be a severe or debilitating worry or generalized anxiety disorder. So up to here, people or researchers have talked, that's just common reactions to abnormal events. Like it's actually normal that you are worried or you're angry or distressed about something. Just when it gets into like you're being impaired in everyday life, it should be even called maladaptive. And that's an area where I've done that's first, like a lot of studies and polling have come up, like who's even experienced climate anxiety. And that's a worldwide poll. That's Brazil is, I think, the next country here, but they use from South America, where you can see more than 2/3 of all respondents, young people between 16 and 25, are actually worried or extremely worried about about climate change. And I think one thing that was really touching was that they also asked whether people were hesitant to have children, and already 40% of all these polled young people are actually hesitant to have children because of climate change. And that is something like, I guess, the older generation. I have 2 daughters already. I feel like, oh, nobody should have that actually, to be thinking about whether they have kids or not, which is a bit worrying. And perhaps I'll skip the next one because we're a bit further in time. But what I would like to present is a study I'm involved with a colleague of mine, Malice Wullenkort in Lund University in Sweden, where she looks at emotion-focused coping strategies. And I have added a little bit of that mindfulness research I've done before. So the question is, and that's super psychological, how can we regulate, or like how can we cope with these feelings that come with climate change? And emotion regulation is the way in which people influence the content, intensity, and timing of their emotions. And that comes in 2 different ways, like more a suppressive one. I try to avoid negative thoughts about climate change. I distance myself, minimize, avoid. I don't even want to have to do with that. Or more integrative way, climate anxiety helps me understand something about myself, or perhaps I should really listen to that and be aware of those emotions and tolerating, accepting them. And that's already a little bit similar to mindfulness, which is more like the unbiased awareness of subjective momentary experience with an open, accepting, benevolent attitude. That's more general sense, independent of climate change or anything. Can you be open to what the current experience is? I can stay open through unpleasant experiences, accepting them, and no need to change them. And that is something that we have found in a survey of ours, has a positive effect, or like a positive relationship to not feeling as much impairment in because of climate change. And in this study, we looked at also impairment of climate change. How much are you already impaired in your everyday life about your worries and thoughts, and what's the actual feeling you feel about when thinking about climate change? And what we found, the results were, there is no direct effect of emotion regulation on climate-related impairment. It's not if you do one thing, you're way better off than if you do another thing. But there is an interaction effect of mindfulness and effect, and that looks like this. Like if you have climate anxious effects, I'm really worried, I'm really worried, distressed about it. And here as an outcome, you have this everyday impairment. I already can't sleep, can't concentrate, can't talk to my friends anymore. You see that mindfulness, it's not a huge effect, but has an interaction effect. It's like buffering the, this is like high mindfulness is the blue line. It's buffering the effect of your climate anxious effect, translating into everyday impairment. So it can help that you actually can keep dealing with whatever your emotions are in everyday life. So I think I'll skip that as well. So we can have 10 more minutes about the last chapter, and then, so the wrap up for the second way, like for the second chapter, adaptation pathways, is many consequences of climate change and further planetary boundaries are already locked in. They are going to happen. That will cause numerous societal and health challenges for societies, amongst them post-traumatic stress disorder, anxieties, impairment in everyday functioning. And that's when overlap of environmental and clinical psychology to investigate and study them comes into fruition. And we can talk about successful coping mechanisms, for example, mindfulness, to base evidence-based intervention approaches on them. Like we shouldn't, if farmers lose everything they have somewhere in the east of Australia, or Or here in Colombia, you probably wouldn't tell them to start meditating. You know, also already has to be tailored. It also has to be tailored on the people who actually need some of those coping mechanisms. And that would be an idea for vulnerable populations. Are definitely farmers all over the world are the first ones to feel climate change. So that's something where psychologists and psychological research can be very fruitful. And now some ideas on this more overlapping cross-sectional topic of understanding public opinion. And that has also something to do, on one hand side, one understand opinion, but then we also, I would be careful to say we do not want to manipulate them, but the way we communicate about it has effects on how people think about things. And whether or not we interfere with the way we communicate it, it does have these effects. So in a way, we're manipulating what people think all the time. Perhaps the question is more like, do we do it intentionally or unintentionally? Yep, and that's a last couple of thoughts. Public opinion polling, it's usually simple measurements. Sometimes it's one item measurements, you know, very rough opinion taking, but it can help, for example, for time series. So this is a typical, that's the Yale program, Climate Change Communication. Very or somewhat worried in the United States over 20 years. You know, you can see that apparently 2004 was where people were very worried. Perhaps it might have been Katrina. I can't remember now. And then it has stopped again. And then it has risen again. But it could also be helpful for international comparison. That's the Eurobarometer. That's, for example, the percentage of people said, I've done something against climate change. So you can read a little bit, for example, you know, look, Luxembourg people apparently are really active on doing something against climate change. Germany is here fourth. In Romania, people are apparently not as worried about that they feel have to do something about it. So even these very rough one-item measures can give you some kind of information. But it's getting obviously more interesting and more important if we throw all our multivariate research methods on it. And for example, look at what does one thing have to do with the other. For example, our ideas about what should be done about mitigation or adaptation of climate change is policy acceptance. And what are the important factors for accepting climate change policies, like that you would accept saying, okay, I will drive less cars or will accept higher prices of gasoline. And there's this wonderful meta analysis. Why do I not have, it's by Bergquist from 3 years ago. So sorry that it doesn't show the source. And what they have looked at, meta-analysis of I don't know how many studies, looked at demographics, psychological factors, climate change evaluation, and policy-specific beliefs. When do people actually accept policies? And what they showed was the psychological factors. Yes, the self-transcendent values or trust, ideology, that would be self-enhancement values, would be, for example, hedonist values. They do have an effect, but not super strong. Much stronger, like the actual concern and risk perception about climate change. But what has the strongest concern, the strongest effect is, do you think the actual measure is effective and fair? So there's a fairness aspect, which I would like to talk about, because fairness, what we deem fair or not fair, is a very psychological topic as well. And just before we go into it, I just wanted to give a little bit of a 1 minute. What do we even say if we talk about climate justice? Is like, as much as the causes, here do you have greenhouse gas emissions in worldwide, Bruckner, of the bottom 50 income percent people, that's the lower half of the world's populations, that's the middle 40, that's the next 9, and that's the top 1 earners in all of the world. Their per capita carbon footprint per year. So we're looking at 0.6 for the bottom half, and we're looking at 50 tons per year in the top 1. That means a top percent earner emits 100 times more than a bottom half earner. That's so on the side of causes, on the side of impacts as well. There's people that would probably be from Bangladesh or Indonesia, a picture of the floods robbing people of all their living. There's, for example, one climate change, although we're also impacted, this is Germany, by the way. One of the impacts is that we will have bigger wine regions in Germany. This is the Rhine region at the moment where wine grows in Germany, and in 20 years' time, this is the projection. You will get to know wine from Germany. You know, that's one of the climate change consequences we'll have to cope with. Obviously, it's not the same than losing all of your income and livelihood. So the impacts will not be will not be distributed evenly either. So this is what the UN says about it. The impacts of climate change will not be borne equally or fairly between rich and poor, women and men, and older and younger generations. So there's a lot to say about climate change, climate justice, and how people perceive it to be fair or not. And that's coming to my last couple of slides, because I would like to present some of the studies, what we could do psychologically about it. And what we would like, or what I've started doing, is like, first of all, we have to see, do people even perceive this? Like, we have data about it, but it seems like people are very oblivious. And then does that affect how they judge the status quo as being fair or legitimate? And does that affect that they want to change it? And there's supposedly moderators of the way we present information on that, and that now coming to framing effects, that will influence if how I perceive the status quo seems to be fair or not. And then there's other moderators that could either influence here or here. For example, person characteristics. A high income person with a really high CO2 emission might judge the whole thing differently than somebody in a very low CO2 emission bracket. And then there's psychological individual differences, like, for example, how sensitive are we to injustice? Does it bother us a lot? Or how entitled do we feel? That's, for example, a psychological variable. We also, I didn't bring anything to present today, but we've looked at, there's differences in how entitled people feel about what they think they have the right to. And about perceiving the status quo is, I was involved in a paper that will just come out. We've just got the acceptance note by Nature Climate Change. It's actually, in a way, it's a simple paper in terms of the task we had was we asked, this is the average carbon emission in your country. And it might be in Colombia, I'm not quite sure. In Germany, it's like 9 tons per capita per year. How much do you think the following groups emit on average? The top 1 income group, the top 10 income group, or the bottom half income group? The same that I just showed you worldwide, just for each individual country. And I think that the strong part of this paper, as we did it in 4 different countries, it was Denmark, India, Nigeria, and United States. So obviously also not representative, but we tried to sample a country with very different actual level of climate greenhouse gas emissions and actual differences. So what you see, the red points is the actual data. So that's the bottom half, top 10, top 1 in Denmark, that's in India, that's in the United States, and that's in Nigeria, where it does not, where the inequality is not as strong. But what you can see in this simple result is people are underestimating dramatically what the top 1 group does, you know, especially in the United States and Denmark, where this disparity is the biggest. In India, the estimations are all over the place anyway, but there is still a big underestimation of the top 10 group. And in Nigeria, it's not as big because the actual disparity is not as big. So what we found, and I think that's why it's been accepted in Nature Climate Change the first time, this perception being empirically shown that people are pretty much oblivious about the actual how big the inequality is. So there's a huge underestimation of top income of top 1% income group in 3 countries, and the bigger the inequality, United States or Denmark, the bigger the underestimation. And now for the second part, what does that have to do with, like, how fair you think things are? That's where the information presentation comes into place. And there's a lot of research in social psychology already that shows the legitimacy of income inequality. So that's the economic area. There's also inequality, and there's been a lot of research about it. It's depends on general perception of the extent of differences, but also on how we describe these differences. And one way of designing a frame, like a frame is usually, it's different ways of presenting logically equivalent data. That's important. Like, it doesn't really say anything different. but it has a different way. In comparative, it's like you just swap the reference and the subject. You say the subject of the comparison owns less than the reference, or you say the subject of the comparison owns more than the reference. So a simple example would be the poor have less than the rich, or the rich have more than the poor. You're saying the same thing, but it makes different psychological processes to start. One is in the less frame, you imagine the hardship or poverty, but wealth is the normal state. Being the rich is the reference, and the subject of comparison is the poor. Where here it's I want to say al revés. It's the other way around. So the poverty would be the norm, and rich people spring out of this norm. And what colleagues in Germany have shown before me, Bruckmüller and Reese, is that it doesn't have a main effect, but it has an interaction effect. So, and that depends on how you perceive the difference. If people think, oh no, there's not that much inequality, it's all good, the more than framing actually leads to less legitimacy. But if people think, oh, high inequality, no, not good, or not good, they just perceive there is high inequality, the less than framing agitates the more, or leads to lesser legitimacy ratings. And we looked at those papers thinking that should also be the case for carbon emissions, but that is nothing that to our knowledge has been done so far. So what we're doing at the moment is a replication for climate, and we just say there's a subject of the comparison that emits less than the reference or emits more. And this is a study running at the moment in Australia with a master project. So that would be the more frame. In Australia, it was 20 tons CO2 equivalent. So the top income is at already 200 tons. So we said, oh, it's roughly 10 times more, 10 times as much than the average. And in the less frame, same information, just the bottom. We started with the bottom 5. That is the 10 tons, which is half of what the average Australian emits. So this is the exact same frame, just applied to CO2. And now I made it probably very suspenseful, but we don't have any data yet. The data collection just started last week. But what we do expect is basically, I think it should be the same effects. We probably would also find an interaction effect. So we wouldn't be able to say, oh, that frame is always better than the other one. But targeted to different audiences, you could frame the inequality either this way or that way. And actually, I would be looking for someone here in Colombia to replicate that study, because the material is already there. You would only need to translate it into Spanish, get the data for Colombia, and then see what people think about. And I think you also have this, don't you have this social strata, these 6 social strata? So it would be perhaps easier to, because one of the things was difficult in the sample to know what the social economic status of the people was with their income, and people do not like to talk about their very high income as much. So perhaps it's easier to replicate it here in Colombia. So now, but that gets me that we get a little bit of time to discussion for the wrap up of the last chapter. Public opinions can be surveyed on attitude, risk perception, preferred responses to climate change. And I think perception on climate justice obviously has been a topic for NGOs for a long time, but now psychologists also wake up to this field. And for the acceptance of policies, perceived fairness is the most important factor. And that actually depends on a lot of psychological processes, like the actual awareness of the inequality, the presentation of the information, and intra-individual differences that we also, like justice sensitivity, we also looked at. So as a wrap up, perhaps I could use this slide again, where we can talk about together and discuss wherever you want to dive deeper into, that you hopefully have gotten an idea. It's not only about changing individual behaviors and making, like people save water and go by bike, although obviously keep doing that. You should not stop doing that. But it's also about influencing these socio-technical regimes, like with different policies, different laws, perhaps different infrastructure. I didn't talk that much about it today. And for those of you who are already working in psychology, this is a short overview of like all these different fields. Of course, environmental is the first one, perhaps, you spring into mind with pro-environmental behavior, but then there's all these other social psychology, collective action, social norms. Then there's health psychology, climate stress or prevention, exercise, which overlaps with traffic and transport psychology, our modes of mobility, Clinical psychology, climate anxiety, trauma is something I mentioned. Educational, I didn't mention that far. They talk a lot about competencies. There's a whole field that's called education for sustainable development and education for sustainable consumption, where psychologists would be welcome. And obviously business and organizational psychology as well, sustainable consumption in the workplace, or corporate social responsibility, which I haven't even touched today. And then we could be talking about individual differences as well, personality psychology that also has an influence. So just to give you an idea, if somebody asks you now, what does psychology have to do with sustainability? Then please answer a whole lot, you know, and you have a lot of different ideas. Thank you very much. So it's got a bit longer than I wanted.
Tiempo para preguntas. Creo que somos pocos por
Sí.
Hi, it's more about the donut model we mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah.
I do psychology and biology, so there's intersection between those. I think on most projects where you hit a wall is when like economic needs kind of contradict environmental or sustainable outcomes. And so on the donut model, it proposes that you need to have your basic needs and some others met to be able to interact around that area. But I don't know, where would you stand in this area in a case like Colombia, where there's lots of poverty, a lot of inequity? What do you think? Like, how do you make a bridge between like the potential, like I need to make a decision right now involving economic preferences, but then this might not be the best for a long-term sustainability? I don't know.
Oh, you're totally clear. No, I totally understand what you're saying. It is difficult. I mean, obviously, it's more a guideline for a rough guideline for my own research, and this is coming from Kate Raworth, is an economist, and it's not really a psychological model. It's more like an overarching guideline, but I think it's a good one to start discussions like that. And what you said totally correctly, that there's usually trade-offs between those two. You know, it's like there might be worldwide, we still might be outside of the donut on both sides. You know, like we haven't met any of those basic needs and we're overshooting it, and that's exactly where this negotiation come into play. What is more important, is it like the social foundations that have to be met first? And I think there is some, I don't know, if I look at it worldwide, because I also lived in a very consumerist society over the last 1.5 years. Australia is one of the highest per capita consumer. Germany is not that much better either. So I think that there's a good discussion basis in saying, if we look in the worldwide comparison, obviously there's countries that are more overshooting than not having social problems. Those are the ones that should contribute more, and it might be a basis for those type of more discussions between countries and negotiations on the UN level for the climate COP, saying this is exactly why we need those countries who are overshooting but have all that covered doing more than countries like Colombia, where people, I don't know what the socioeconomic level here is at the moment. I feel like, I mean, obviously I've only come here yesterday, but I felt like there is some stability in terms of food and water and like basic things. But if you go into perhaps already gender equality or education or income, there might be more problems already. And I think if you're interested in that literature, there's a whole literature now spanning from that's called that corridor model, because obviously it's some kind of corridor model, because you wanna have a corridor where you can't tell everybody you have to exactly land on 3.6 tons per person, but there's a corridor idea. And there's papers also from sociology and economy exactly in this discussion, negotiating how much is the lower threshold that everybody on this planet should have. And perhaps we should also talk about upper thresholds and not allow richness to be accumulated, CO2 emissions. We're talking a lot about the lower threshold, or more about the lower threshold at the moment than the upper threshold, but that there should be a corridor that defines those two. But I'm not too familiar with like all of that literature, but I can point you out to some of the authors talking about that. Yeah.
The educational field and to the early years. And I was wondering about the difference between your research is on this with older people, and the difference between working with younger. It can help if you could pinpoint some research and what are the some, no, how do you help them change their, or not change because they haven't.
They haven't, yeah, they haven't done anything wrong yet. Yeah.
That or
Mm.
affected from.
Oh, it's super difficult question because I'm not really an expert working with younger kids. Like I can tell you the furthest down we went in age-wise was a project on that mindfulness and consumption patterns with adolescents. And that from a research perspective, that already brought me to my limits of being able to manage that project because it's super difficult to work with adolescents. They didn't want to fill in the our scales, like the whole measurement idea didn't work. They didn't want to do the meditating experience that we had set up for them. So it was a whole challenge already with that age group. So, and I've never worked with age groups younger than that. What I could tell you more from that clinical perspective, I think it would be more by now already starting early thinking about resilience building and that not that much changing their behavior, but more like how can they become resilient facing all these problems that's going to come in the years to come. And one thing, and that's what I've in the context of those mindfulness projects, I've heard about these initiatives, but I don't know too much about the details. Just already incorporating mindfulness techniques and sitting with emotions, regulating stress from as early as kindergarten. I don't know how it's like preschool, 4 or 5 years old, that they already start learning regulating emotions. And I think that our research points to if you grown up later, it'll help. That's perhaps something I could point you to, but much more I don't know about. I don't know much about the compassion research. With like the age group would still be under 10 or something like that. Like even, you know, the way of our usual diagnostics or our usual empirical data gathering, it's a different, it's almost like a different, perhaps Johan could say more about that. You've worked with kids in the migration crisis here. It's like almost like a different field of research because you have to adapt that to them. With compassion, I mean, obviously compassion was part of our mindfulness program, but only like one exercise amongst many. I could send you a material of that mindfulness exercises we did, but that was aimed at adolescents and older. You have a question?
It's more of a hypothesis, but maybe this has been done already. And I was wondering whether risk exposure is linked somehow with goal engagement, whether countries like ours were more likely to experience the effects of climate change are more likely to engage in actions to change that situation, or whether there's no information about that.
You mean how much you're aware of climate change goals is or climate change impacts is impacting the level of how people engage?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some discrepancy in that, you know, like even the simple data in, you know, what the Eurobarometer, what people are willing to do, how high the percentage is of what people are willing to do is not really connected to the actual climate change consequences this country is going to face. Oh, that wasn't your question?
So I was just wondering if that's not the case. You have some areas that you've identified, like, let's say, the social status, like people in very unequal countries who have a higher exposure, maybe are less likely to engage in those actions.
Because they feel less responsible,
Yeah.
because they haven't, I mean, I didn't bring any of the descriptive data of that paper because we also looked at some of the differences, but they were like very different. The differences of the different income groups, you know, like because we also sampled different income groups, like I just showed the overall results, but that, for example, there was differences in that upper 10% bracket. We sampled like 10%, the upper 10% of each of those 4 countries. There was differences in that they kind of negated the problem, like they had a lower problem awareness, and also like a lower, one of the questions was like, how fair do you think the actual situation is? And there was also effect, but not in all of the 4 countries. So I would have to have a look at that. So there's also effects on what is your own income group now with the information that is correlate very highly with your greenhouse gas emissions, that people from high income groups are less likely to find it unfair, to even think it's a problem, and less willing to. That was also another question: how much do you advocate for policy to be implemented against climate change? So there's a lot more about that particular paper of these 4 different countries that might be interesting for you to look at, because it has these different income groups that is a proxy for different greenhouse gas emissions. We don't know the greenhouse gas emissions of the people, but we have the proxy of which income group you are, of being the higher income, the higher income group. The harder thing what was to read in that paper was like the effects. There's only few effects that have been that emerged in all of the 4 countries. So with almost every effect you have to look, is it for Denmark or United States, or is it for Nigeria or India? And they were quite different. So there's no that clear overall picture, but I remember that there's a couple of main effects for that, which income group you're from yourself, that affects. So it's almost like high income group people try to downplay the actual situation. And one thing which you found in another study is that your income affects how much you're impaired by climate change emotions. And I think there's a buffer effect of, you know, that money can buy you some security. You know, you can buy health services. You can buy, I mean, and obviously if you're in the very in the upper 1%, you could even buy your own private island somewhere, or build a bunker somewhere against climate change, which is obviously a very extreme case. But so I feel like your own income gives you some kind of buffering function against what climate change has in store for us in consequences. I hope I got your question right. Otherwise, we'll drink another coffee and then. Yeah.
Maybe this is a reflection, not with an answer specifically.
Yeah.
Because I'm not. I'm in neuroscience, so I'm learning about.
And neuroscience.
Yes,
Oh,
so I'm
whole different
learning about
cup of
this.
tea.
Yeah, psychology. But I'm wondering if we are. Well, there's many people doing individual action, right?
Yeah.
Because there's many people convinced that many things we can do, right? And in the other line, the extreme, is government giving laws and maybe something like impuestos. Yes.
Infrastructures?
Yes,
Or-
like in addition, yes, like individuals and the government in the other side. So I think there is many things that we can do in the middle to approach, because people can have the motivation, yes, but not the ways to do it in our country, for example, in Colombia, because we are working for environment, for climate change and everything, and we know there are rules, there are laws, but how we can really work in psychology to people know it and apply it to their lives and to understand, because it's not so easy to apply something.
I think-
to what.
Absolutely. You make a couple of really good points. I think I wouldn't see it as much as opposed individuals versus the state, because that's also a bit abstract, and the state is more different entities. That's why I really like this sociological model of individual being at a lower level, and that's why we sometimes might feel less powerful to change things, and that there is like this powerful regime with like not only policy but also culture, industry that's already put a lot of things in places. For example, bicisendas or not, you know, like a lot of infrastructure is already dictating a lot of behavior. But what I really like about this model is also talking about that individual, especially if they're organized in like niche groups, they can exert a pressure on the regime as well. It's perhaps harder and it's a long process, but a lot of inventions and novelties, especially in sustainability development, also have been brought forth by a group of very dedicated people first starting something. For example, there's a really interesting documentation about how solar power came into the mainstream in Germany. That has been, they even called it the solar rebels in the Black Forest. It was like a very dedicated group in a small village that had started to put up their own solar panels, all in like a cooperative owned. It was the first energy independent village in all of Germany. That was in the 80s when after Chernobyl exploded, and in Germany there was a big fear of nuclear energy, and they did not want to change the coal mining or the coal industry for nuclear, which was back then the way. And then they started just doing it just doing a different way. And that's an example for niche being able to exert some kind of pressure. And when their time had come, and that's probably also like, sometimes it needs these big socio-technological landscapes, as hard as this sounds, but you know, Fukushima, for example, the big nuclear accident in Japan, that was 2013. That started that even Angela Merkel was back then chancellor in Germany, super conservative, a little bit green. She was the green minister before that, before she became chancellor, which now everyone forgot, but she was our green minister before she became chancellor. That's when she phased out nuclear. Like 2 weeks after, like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to phase out the nuclear reactors in Germany we have. So sometimes it needs this social, it needs this, there's some energy rebels in the Black Forest, and then there's explosions of nuclear reactors somewhere else in the world, and that creates the regime to change. So I think there is some power, although it might be harder to exert.
There are, for example, many international conferences that are that have some programs here in Colombia, but not, for example, in urban, but in rural, you know.
So not in the rural area or in the rural area?
But we don't know, it's in the rural area.
Mm.
So we don't even really don't know many things that we are doing here in Colombia, but many people doesn't know. So
I mean, obviously every country has their own specifics, and I'm not too familiar with like the specifics of like the challenges here in Colombia yet. I hope I get to learn a little bit more about your beautiful country. But I think what my main point was today as well is psychology is more than only convincing every individual person here to drop less waste, go by bicycle more often. And this is what we've done for a long time. Like even, I think most of my research, how I also got my habilitation in the TU in Berlin, most of it was down here, you know, like niche innovations or like this what can individuals do differently, different psychological theories on how we motivate people, behavioral interventions to eat better and healthy, more sustainable. And now only in the last couple of years, probably the two, 3 last years, the environmental, we have in our German Society of Psychology, we have a subgroup that's environmental psychology. It's like 100 of us. We're the smallest group, but a couple of very dedicated people started looking at more those sociological models as well. So we have something to say to you as well. And one big thing is, for example, public opinion. How can we understand public opinion and also creating communication ways, that acknowledge the effects that how we frame stuff has an impact on people. But also there's new research, one of a PhD students of mine, which I also didn't come in here, how our environments affect our behavior, for example, in eating behavior, like where we eat, like whether we eat out with other people or not, influences how much meat we eat, which is something we didn't really think about. We thought more it was like an internal health thing or values thing, but also just like having company, for example, in cultures where meat is still like something you show off. You know, it's like in Germany, if you want to have a good meal, then you eat meat, and vegetarian is like still regarded somewhat less valuable. How our surroundings also influence that. So that would also be between that interchange between the meso level and the micro level. And I think, yeah, psychology has a lot to do and a lot to develop as ideas as well. Oh, there's a lot. Okay, here, and then there. Yeah.
As you were talking about how you can add towards, you know, being more sustainable if you have knowledge. But I found in my current job that they work on particular solutions for farmers.
For farmers.
They teach things about sustainability. It's sometimes really hard to find information that is just like evidence-based on how to be sustainable in many ways and how to teach that, you know, to try to give out the information when sometimes the information that the farmers have
is contradicting or
it's hard for them to act towards being sustainable when there is so much information that they find like, well, you say this, and then I read this, and it says another thing. What do I do?
And I think that's exactly one of those problems with, what I earlier said. Obviously, knowledge about something doesn't change behavior directly. There's also another layer below that there's different types of knowledge as well. Like, I don't know whether you were talking about the scientific basis of something, for example, different agricultural practices, or the environmental impact would be more something, scientific knowledge about what do I do with that soil, for example, that it keeps longer, is a different thing from like knowing what the problem base is. For example, what I mean, like the problem that there is, or the actual ways how to counter that problem, is more like action knowledge or behavioral knowledge about what to do about it. And just because you have system knowledge or problem knowledge about what the underlying cause is, doesn't mean like what you could most possibly or best do about it. And for a specific case, as in I don't know, farmers in Colombia, I wouldn't know what to say. It's just yeah, it's important. I think that's the point about knowledge. It's necessary but not sufficient. It's a necessary base of being able to behave in an informed way, but it's not a necessary automatic connection. So as soon as you know, you will do it. But without the knowledge, you won't be able to do it anyway. So I think that's a good point to start. And where to get good, verifiable, reliable information on a particular problem, it is a problem with the internet and more false information and more confusing thing. I think I can't really help on that, only that it is complicated, and it's important to find the right information on these different levels. What's the problem? What's the systemic knowledge, and what do we do about it, like the more behavioral knowledge about it? That was a question too.
What the target people were for the VR program. So what, like, taking into account what you said was, if we applied it to people, business decision makers, international business, these sort of programs, maybe we could have a bigger impact.
Super good. Oh, thank you for that thought, because we were obviously thinking about that as well. Right now, it has started as a project more in education for sustainable consumption. Pia Spangberger is an expert in how to incorporate media and virtual reality in education in general. So hers wasn't even sustainability in the beginning. So that's why I think our cooperation was so fruitful, because I was coming more from the content and she from the form, like how can we educate young people? It was upper high school. So last years of high school, they were between one of the studies, the other ones were young in vocational schools, but also late teens, early 20s, because obviously what she would like to take that approach to is more like, how can we take that to the classroom, like where sustainability things are taught. For example, the tree application would be super to apply to some kind of sustainability curriculum where we talk about ecosystems, or about the importance of the rainforest for all these global ecological services the rainforest does for us. And not only having all this information, but also making you feel, how does it feel if you're part of the rainforest? So her big idea is like, how can we incorporate this virtual reality elements into a real classroom setting, which has not happened yet. Like at the moment, we're still in this more laboratory setting. But when we talked about it in Australia, we had a couple, for example, we had one dyslexic person, paralizado. She loved it. She was like, I can't even walk through the forest anymore. And it was so touching. She's like, this could be a vulnerable group, but that's more, in terms of the emotional impact. And what you're saying, we were actually talking about that this should be brought to decision makers, like making them having this really impactful emotional experience. And I know that there's one project that has brought decision makers to Antarctica to see glacier melting, or Arctica. I can't remember whether Arctica or Antarctica. But it was about making them experience something really impactful emotionally. Because I should look that up. At the moment, we don't have any grasp on decision makers in higher organizations. But I think that's a very interesting idea, making people who actually sit at some leverage points to have this. I will keep that in mind.
About you mentioned how there are already some communities and people that have faced traumatic environmental experiences and have had like a lot of environmental losses, and I was wondering if perhaps those communities were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors, if there's any information about that, and also if like all that anxiety about the environment and that ecological grief, perhaps there have been any interventions in those communities to turn that grief and that anxiety into action?
That's part of what I skipped because of time. I'm sorry about. Very good question. Like I will try only briefly. We have different data on extreme weather events. We asked people, have you lived through an extreme weather event? It was flood storms, droughts, whatever we had in Germany. And it had an effect in our German sample. And it did not, the British study, that's a British study by Whitmarsh, she only asked for flood experience, which didn't have an effect, which I don't have an explanation for that right now. Like that needs to be consolidated in more studies. I would say my gut feeling is, of course, it would influence if you have lived through an extreme weather event, whether you are more impaired in everyday life and more worried about everyday life and climate change. So right now it's a little bit, there's ambiguous evidence how important that is, but I would say probably more, yes, I guess if more studies emerge, that there would come up more positive effects. It's still on the wrong computer, sorry. And then the other study I skipped was just about that. An Australian study, super interesting. They looked at different emotions. Like, what are you, if you're miserable, if you're afraid, or if you're angry and frustrated. And what we can see, eco-anxiety is more negatively related. But anger is positively related to collective action and to individual action. So that exactly what you said, you're more likely to become active when you get angry about the state of the world as when you get afraid about the world. And that's a very good evidence base for designing intervention. I do not know of any interventions right now that actually harvest that emotion. You know, like, okay, anger is a motivating emotion. It's not something that always has to be damped down and meditated away, but it can be channeled into climate action. Marlies Willenkott, my colleague in Sweden, she does look at different emotions as well. But I think hers was so far more like how to use these emotion regulations to cope with the emotions, not so much to harvest them for collective action, but that is something where that research could go to. Yep, that we actually try to what would that anger lead you to do? Yep, you had a good notch. Perhaps I skipped the wrong study.
La última pregunta.
Why fairness is not a psychological variable in that conceptual framework?
That's a very good question. We would need to ask that Mr. Bergquist why he would have. I think it was more to do about the actual policy. I know what you're talking about. Like he would have. I'll try to find that slide. Come on, mouse, where are you? Where were we? I've got too many slides, but I know what you. Around here? No. Yeah, that one. I'm sorry that I omitted the source. I can let you know later. But he's also a psychologist, Bergquist, and I think that was just like the typical psychological factors, irrespective of policies. You know what kind of trust in. I think that ideology is more like your political, either left wing or right wing, the self-transcendental values, and I think that was more policy specific, like whether not what you thought the state of the world was fair, but whether the policy itself was fair. So I think my turn to it is a little bit of an indirect at the moment, that, you know, what if you perceive something as fair, it would be more likely that you accept a policy about it. But that's the particular meta analysis was about whether you thought the policy was fair. What we're trying to show now is like, is it more likely, if you think the whole situation is not fair, that you want to do something about it? And I'm actually really excited about the data if it comes out, because I do feel like that should have an effect, how fair you think the status quo is if you accept policy.
I believe the same.
Yeah, at least somebody who's supervising master's students, because we already have the material, and some of the tasks are a replication of that paper that's already in press now, or that that will be out soon. Yeah, it'd be lovely to have data from Colombia as well. Do you have an idea how dispersed the climate, like the climate inequality is here in Colombia? Is it more like, I don't know, Nigeria is something like 3 times as much, or I think United States was the biggest one. It's like 20 times as much at least, like from one group to the other. Yeah, but more like the US. Yeah, I think, and the biggest driver of the first percent is mobility, plane rides, going everywhere, and big houses. So it's like if people have more than one house and maintain all that. And I think I might even have that. There's a World Bank database where we had that from with all the countries, so we could even look at that. Yeah.
One last question on this.
Very last.
Very last.
Because in the different income groups, you have different values. Like there is more eccentric people, there is more egoistic people.
Ah, you're talking about a confound. Yep.
And then how to measure that, because the status quo can also be perceived. I think values would play like
A role in that as well.
Like
I think it's a first study, and that was done with economists. Like there was probably half economists, half psychologists, and I felt with a couple of individual differences, we should have measured them. For example, we also did not measure these. There's different concepts of fairness as well. For example, even distribution or everyone to their needs, and that's something I would like to follow up in that. Like what I have a. But there was an honor students, like we don't have that much data points. You have only 70 data points, so I wouldn't give that much on the data. But where we looked at this justice sensitivity as another disposition, you know, that people are more, there's a victim sensitivity, or I'm always worse than everyone else, or there is like a perpetrator once, or I am aware of that I got more than someone else. So there's these different sensitivities. I think they would all influence those perceptions of the status quo. So I think that would be the next rounds, like this perception of the status quo with the policy acceptance and all these all these psychological differences in people on these fairness ideas. So
there's also it is very important to have in mind which sectors you are asking, because I don't know if it's like a general type of participants, like citizens, or have you thought about asking for sectors, like economic sectors?
Yeah, there was a way to short presentation of that study. That's something I said to the earlier question. We know the income of people, and we've sampled a 10% upper income break on purpose, oversampled that. So we have half of, let's say, colloquially super rich people, and then we have half of the other 90%. And we have some of these descriptive differences that people in the upper income bracket say, no, not that bad, the inequality, no, not that bad, climate change, but not in all of the 4 countries. So it's not that clear of a picture all over the place, but yes, we do have that information. And the paper's coming out, like we have the in press, I think it was 2 weeks ago that we got but it's not out yet. So and the thing is, the paper itself, as in those Nature climate formats, is quite short, and the appendix is like 40 pages, and all this appendix is like especially this within country differences, that in Denmark, the rich people said something different than the rich people in United States, to say it shortly. So yeah, but there is this information. And they do differ, you're right. Like people with a lot of money do differ in their opinions.
Muchísimas gracias.
No, muchísimas gracias a ustedes para traerme y por la audiencia tan motivada. Gracias.
Sí, una última palabra, pues primero nuevamente gracias por esta masterclass sobre este tema, y que nos da una perspectiva enorme de todo lo que hay por hacer en esta área. Y pues invitarlos para el lunes 3:30, seguiremos con un poco más de profundidad.
Sí, pero más aburrido con metodología, ¿no? Como de cómo hacemos cosas en psicología, y cómo medimos, y cómo hacemos experimentos, y sí.
Pero bueno, siempre invitados, y muchas gracias por participar. Gracias.
Hablé un montón, ¿no? Perdón, hablé un montón.
No,
Pobrecita.
mira, 9 minutos que nos pasamos, perfecto.